Welcome back to Crosstabs. I'm your host, Farrah Bostic. The conversation I'm bringing you today, I recorded about a month ago. Today is May 7th, 2025, and it is with a really dear friend of mine who I have known for, I don't know how long at this point, 20 years probably. And I met him because we both worked in advertising. We're both strategists, and we have a fun conversation here that I'm really excited to share with you. But I think one of the things that informed that conversation, in addition to my totally wonky internet connection, was that we were thinking through what would happen when or if the proposed tariff program really went into effect. And so a lot of what we were talking about was how political decisions and the data upon which those political decisions rest, the kind of conception of what the electorate is and what it wants and what will make it happy and healthy and rich, trickles down into business. So we're not really in a situation where political research and market research are separate. We're all sort of dependent on what is going on in the political economy in order for us to make business decisions. It is certainly affecting my business. I'm sure it's affecting lots of other people who work in this kind of consulting, and it is definitely affecting my clients' businesses as well. When you have times of uncertainty and signals of recession everywhere, but no actual recession, it makes it really hard to plan. And so we have a conversation that is really circling around this question of how uncertainty and a kind of fictional idea of a nice, beautiful distribution curve where we just organize ourselves around the average really doesn't work in times of uncertainty and economic disparities and very different local environments depending on where you live in the country that is the United States or where you live around the world. So Faris Yakob is the co-founder with his partner Rosie of Genius Steals, which is a consultancy and strategy firm. They give talks all over the world. They have been in the advertising business for a really long time. They're two of the smartest people that I know. And Faris joined me to talk about decision-making, strategy, the average, and what the heck is going on with the economy. And I bring you that conversation now. We tried to have this conversation before, but I was having internet problems. So we are doing this as a second attempt. And of course, in the meantime, the world has changed. Which it sort of does way too frequently anyway, I think. But the thing I wanted to talk to you about was a bunch of thinking and writing you've been doing about the kind of, obviously you wrote about the YOLO economy, you've written about this kind of consumer divide where you have this very wealthy set of consumers and then kind of everybody else. And it seems like a good time to revisit both of those ideas, given the tariffs that we have decided to leverage on almost every country in the world.
Yeah, okay. I think there are now 4 pieces to this unfolding story. And then the last piece arrived this week with the, things that have been happening. So in 2023, post-ish pandemic, pretty much every economist in the world predicted quite confidently a recession. Now, when I wrote about this originally, I was like, where's the recession we were promised? Because I'm hilarious. Now, it didn't happen. And if you look back at economists' predictions, economists have never predicted in any kind of systematic way any recession ever in history. Their cognitive models tend to work in the other direction sometimes. So historically, they've never predicted en masse any recession at all. So that's not surprising. It's not a predictive science in that sense, it would appear, because it hasn't predicted anything. So that's unfortunate. But the macro numbers in 2013 were very good, right? 2023, sorry, were great. Like the American economy was doing gangbusters. The stock market was doing gangbusters. Everybody was buying flights, even though they were more expensive. Flights were full. The TSA had its busiest travel day in history. Lots of pent-up demand was clearly being expressed in the market. Now, this made intuitive sense. We have the term pent-up demand to describe this phenomena. And it does tend to splurge on kind of paying yourself back for several years of not doing the thing you wanted, which often could be a vacation or a handbag or something, I assume, right? But at the same time, the numbers in what you were hearing from people and everybody's life experience and stuff seemed to not be concordant with the macro. There was this huge gulf between what the averages were saying broadly and what the people seem to be saying everywhere. And we know the cost of living has gone up a lot. We know inflation has been doing stuff, etc. We know that jobs haven't paid any more money and job security hasn't got any more secure. So I was like, well, how is this all working, right? So how is this all this money? And people were like, oh, they got these checks during the pando. And I'm like, if you get like $4,000 worth of checks in 2 years, I mean, is that going to buy you a vacation even at this point in the cycle? I feel no, personally. But anyway, maybe.
Not now
So
that they've
I
closed
was
the
like, yeah,
national
I don't really
parks.
buy it. Well, yeah, I mean, I didn't really buy it. I was like, something weird is going on, it feels like. My initial foray into understanding this was that, okay, everybody has sort of got a bit bored with not being able to do what they wanted. And because of this increasing polycrisis situation of uncertainty, people are like prone to hyperbolic discounting, where the future becomes so uncertain and the pathway to success and middle-class comfort and home ownership, etc., seems frankly unavailable to the majority, at least at this point. So everybody is just like pulling their spending forward, right? They are YOLO spending and they're going like, let's just do it now while I still have access to capital and liquidity and so on. But at the same time, credit card debt started to go up quite dramatically. I think at this point now we're about $1.4 trillion of unsecured credit card debt in America, slightly more of unsecured car loans. Cars are very expensive now. Americans love big cars. They've all bought very big ones they can't afford, apparently. And defaults have begun to emerge at the highest rates in a while, interest rates being obviously higher than they were previously. So I was like, well, how long can that go for? What kind of runway does credit card spending give the majority of the economy to buy things that essentially are luxury goods, right? Because, you know, at a certain point, you have to make trade-offs from vacations and heat and food and stuff. So that confused me. And I was like, what's the runway possibility here? And like credit cards don't like defaulting in large numbers. It's not good for them to do it. So they tend to be flexible at the bottom end. And that they also like people who don't pay off every month because that's where their profit comes from. People who pay off every month make credit cards zero money. In fact, they cost them money because they get all the miles. And it's a system that rewards people that don't need to use it, essentially. That's the nature of credit in America, especially. So I thought that was weird. And then a couple other things began to happen. Brands, particularly the Jaguar Furore on the discourse, clearly were saying something, not just in terms of aesthetics and whatever. They were saying we're going to try and double the price of our cars and sell much less of them at much higher margin because that seems like a better approach strategically for our product. We think we can shift it upmarket enough to sell a few thousand cars at twice the price rather than selling twice as many at half, etc., or whatever the margin for profile is. So like premiumization appeared to be a strategy that's happening writ large, and still the makeup of the economy didn't make sense. And I don't know, I just looked at this article this morning that I sent you about why that might be and what averages are and where averages came from historically and how they didn't used to use the mean, which is the mean is the total divided by the number of things inside the group, right? And we used to use the median. Newton preferred the median. And why averages ended up being used is because they mathematically tend to appear at the very top of a bell curve, a standard distribution curve, right?
Yes.
So because a lot of human stuff very neatly like distributes itself into bell curves, like height and stuff like that,
right?
It made a lot of mathematical sense to go with the mean, the average, to try to describe complex sets of variable numbers in a shorthand way that was indicative and useful and directional and so on. But the assumption underlying that is standard distribution, sort of by definition. The mathematical assumption of why an average of that nature is useful to understand anything is standard distribution, is a bell curve. And if the income of a place is completely unlike the bell curve distribution, which it now is, it indicates that averages may be less useful at the macro level to tell us what's going on. So I was thinking about that. And then last month-ish, Moody's came out with a report which basically cleared this up and which explained what was going on. They said, for the first time in possibly ever, but a very long time, 50% of all consumer spending in the world's biggest economy, the USA, and the economy in the USA is primarily driven by consumer spending, 80% plus, was now made up of 10% of households. So 10% of households that have the most money, earning above 250 with assets beyond that and so on. We're doing half of all the spending in the country, making up a third of America's GDP. And the other 90% of people were making up half of the other half, right? And you can imagine that distribution probably is not exact, right? The things they're buying are probably going to be different because they have disposable income, but they don't, essentially. Which began to explain the variance. Basically, the top 10% started spending a lot more on stuff they wanted because they had access to capital and they could. And their pent-up demand had more runway. All of which was gravy, right? So I wrote before this week, that 10% functionally become the reason we're not in recession, and you need to keep finding them. And as a marketer, inevitably businesses will bifurcate towards premium and non-premium offerings to try and cover the bases, right? You need margin, so you've got to chase those with money. You need volume, so you chase the rest. All of which makes sense. But then we come to now. Now, when people feel rich, they spend money, and when they don't feel rich, they spend less money. At least that's kind of what economics suggests, right? The top 10% of wealth owners in the country, the aforementioned 50% of consumption spending, are also 80% of ownership of stocks. And the stock market has been doing gangbusters on the AI bump and so on, right? So these people felt much richer than they maybe were on paper because the stock market was doing gangbusters. So what happens when a significant portion of those who are not billionaires, who can lose 100 billion and still be the richest person in the world, suddenly find their portfolios, like all of ours, decimated for the time being with an uncertain pathway back to growth? Historically, stock markets do go back up eventually. They just always have over enough period of time. You need like a 10-year horizon though. So my assumption is what's going to happen now is that a significant portion of that 10% will stop spending so much money because they just looked at their portfolios and went, that's not good. And that will inevitably appear in a slowdown in consumer spending among those categories which most serve those richest people.
So that is a terrific way to start this conversation. Literally, Monday night, I taped the Bean cast with Bob Norp, and we were talking about this at the start of the show, and the fact that kind of 90% of the consumer market is, of course, going to downgrade by brand to get lower prices to begin with. They're going to buy in bulk. They're going to buy on offer. They're going to pull forward purchases in time. They're going to buy less frequently. All of those things, like those are standard patterns of what happens when people in the bottom 90%, which is a weird phrase to use, but in the bottom 90%, feel crunched. Like we saw it in the last recession. We see it in every recession. But you're absolutely right that this is the thing that's different is and I think here's the other layer I would add to this. I think a lot of people are thinking about the high prices that will necessarily come from these tariffs, particularly on luxury goods, which are generally speaking manufactured someplace else. But Chris Mims from the Wall Street Journal posted about this earlier today of like they're underrating just literally not being able to purchase those goods at all. That like certain luxury goods are actually going to disappear from the US market because the tariffs will be too onerous and the logistics and everything else of trying to comply with those tariffs will be ridiculous. And also just like, there was also some reporting today about kind of conversations happening in the EU about, well, we're just going to kind of pretend that we're willing to play nice and wait for you guys to implode. And we haven't even begun to turn any screws on you yet. We've offered you 0 for 0. You're not going to take it. We look reasonable. You look unreasonable. That's a good position for us to be in. But there's a whole lot of spigots we can start turning off. There's a whole lot of screws we can start to turn. And not just the little ones in the back of the iPhone that the administration thinks is going to be a great job. But even Jaguar Land Rover saying, we're not shipping anything until we can figure out what the heck's going on.
Nintendo Switch 2 has just pulled the pre-launch sale date until they can work out how much they need to charge to make money on it now.
What you have laid out is a very good kind of consumer-oriented explanation for how we get to here, which is this, everybody is telling me that the economy is great, but I am barely making rent and I can't afford a new car and I'm already looking for coupons on things and I'm maxed out on my credit cards and they have lowered my limit so I can't continue to spend on debt. All the things that happen to you if you make less than $75,000 a year. And I think even, in politics, one of the interesting things, I just interviewed the author of a book called Party of the People. It's describing this kind of new populist coalition of kind of on the edges, socially more conservative and but fiscally very liberal, like people who want more labor protections, who want higher minimum wages, who want more of an industrial policy, all of that kind of thing. The way that they divide income in polling is basically, do you make more than $80,000 a year or less than $80,000 a year? And the weird thing that happens in that is a weird distortion of like, well, there's a lot of people in the 80,000 plus who are Democrats, but I wonder what happens when you get to the 250,000 plus. And they don't break it down like that. And so there is this like, we're just always, through a glass darkly looking at the economy, consumers, voters, everybody else, because we do these very rough cuts and then we talk about the average all the time. I will add one other thing. We are working on an episode about the father of the BMI, the guy who actually kind of introduced the use of averages en masse.
Body mass index,
and so, literally it was like, oh, well, we can use this to figure out where planets are going to be in the night sky. So we can figure out what the optimal size of a French soldier is. Like, no, they are not similar concepts, my man.
No, I mean, there are certain mechanistic aspects to how gravity works, whereas there's much more complexity with how people work in general, unfortunately. And the desire to impose mechanistic thinking or deterministic thinking or inherently stochastic problems is, so it's implicit, right? Like, countries can only see in numbers. Entities of that size can only see in numbers, which means they have to be thinned out. Anything qualitative can't really make it to the top of 1,000 billion people or whatever it is, right? Yeah. So that's sort of inherent. And the models by which finance especially understands risk tends towards deterministics. Like, even though they accept there's a degree of wobbliness, they don't embrace as much stochastic thinking, even though strategy inherently is designed to try and operate in stochastic environments rather than deterministic ones. Otherwise, you wouldn't need strategy; you would just make a machine that works. But so that's sort of part of it. It's sort of endemic. But to your point, first of all, right, that the trade war, the tariff situation. I don't feel comfortable or competent enough to try and like sane wash what appears to be instinctive approaches to geopolitics, right? At the same time, geopolitics is upstream of business and economies, which is, geopolitics is upstream of economies, economies are upstream of business, business is upstream of marketing, marketing is upstream of advertising. So we inevitably, whatever happens up here changes everything for us. And because advertising is capex, we know it's going to get turned off for lots of brands. Ultimately, if you're making decisions between investing more in your brand now or keeping some people in jobs, that's a difficult trade-off, I would say. I don't know how personally I would make that choice or that argument, because it makes me feel uncomfortable. Spend more on brand advertising, but we just laid off millions of people. Yeah, but, we need money.
There were a lot of companies that turned off their marketing budgets in the pandemic because they expected a recession to happen, and it didn't. And they missed out on low interest rates, which would have been the perfect time to be spending on demand generation. And instead, they sat it out, and that was bad for them then. It isn't great in recessions either to turn off demand generation, because when out of the ashes of whatever recession come new entrants, new retailers die, new retailers emerge, whatever. And so like, if you weren't sort of steady through the crisis, you may kind of semi-permanently lose a lot of customers, and that can be really tricky too. But you're absolutely right. Like, it is capex, it's an expenditure. You're going to cut it.
The evidence is relatively robust. If you keep spending, you get cheaper share of voice, and you get to accelerate coming out of recessions. But it's a cost that you need to think about in terms of how you spend money as a business, which is broader. Yeah. So I guess 3 bits, right? To your point, when companies pull investment, like Keen said, it becomes a sort of recession becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy when you think it's coming and you stop acting as a company, and then it impacts the entire economy, therefore it slows down. The signals of that have already been in place for a while, to your point. Like, companies went on a mad hiring spree, especially tech companies, during the pando. Suddenly things changed quickly, but underneath them, and they went, okay, let's get rid of a lot of people. And right now, even though employment rate is at historical semi-lows, the hiring rate is less than half of what it should be at the same unemployment rate. And if the job market is frozen.
Yeah.
People with jobs are not going to leave them because it's a recession, probably, and people need jobs. And so, and companies aren't hiring in advance of growth because they can't guarantee that growth and they can't justify the spend now, basically, right? Taking on employees comes with various contractual obligations, not as much in America because of employment at will, but, it's still a pain in the ass and it costs money. And so, and plus, return to office mandates seem to be suggesting that there's not enough space left anyway for a lot of people. So that's going to make it harder for that. So that's the first bit. The second bit is, like, if I understand at all, there's a thing called the Mar-a-Lago Accords. Are you familiar with this paper?
Yes.
Right. So I haven't read it. I listened to podcasts about it. But if I understand the economic thinking behind it, the narrow path that could possibly lead to growth in this strategy comes only on the assumption of capitulation by the rest of the world under the great might of the empire that is America and its financial and military muscle. If that doesn't happen, the strategy, if that is something we can say it is, in place, probably can't work. Because to your point, like, America's economy, like everybody else's, is entirely interconnected.
Yeah.
And you aren't going to build factories in a 4-year period fast enough to do anything useful to the economy. So, I think it's like an arms race. It's literally that. It's a fight. And who's going to back down first? The little countries will basically give away because they have to. And the bigger blocks will start going, I can't allow this. And, it probably triggers some incipient, to your point about the sort of rising nationalism that people are feeling. I think that might sort of not gel with the capitulation plan that is entirely sort of front and center for these things to work, if work is even the way of thinking about this. At the same time, the top 1%, whilst losing hundreds of billions of dollars, are pretty much insulated to the point where they couldn't care less. I mean, like, maybe not top 1, but you know what I mean.
Yeah. It's going from being worth $500 billion to $300 billion. Like, I mean, Abigail Disney the other day was saying, like, I don't know, if you make more than 999 million, are you going to be sad? Like, the thing that I think about with, yes, the Mar-a-Lago Accords, and also just like trying to think through this moment. So there's kind of two things I would say. One is, it is not a question of your qualifications or intellect in the ability to sanewash this policy, because it would be sanewashing. It would not be logical or educated in any possible, grounded in reality at all. The other thing about it is, like, they are, they keep analogizing. He keeps talking about, like, the greatest moment in American, the American economy was like 1870 to 1912, which is just like, who told you that? And also, like, let's just tick off the number of things that have changed since 1912. Like, there are countries in Europe that weren't countries yet. Right? Like, they did not have national identities then. They do now. They are part of a European Union now. They survived 2 world wars in between 1912 and today. The global economy is so interconnected that no one even knows how to calculate these tariffs, because this thing gets made in Canada, and this thing gets made in Mexico, and this thing gets made in Vietnam, and we ship them around to different places to assemble them, and then they come into the United States for some finishing or packaging process.
Yeah.
So, how do you even begin to figure out the new cost of your goods, which is, to your point, why the Switch is, like, off the market for the moment while they try to figure out how to price the thing. And you also have, against this, the European Central Bank lightening some of the restrictions on borrowing for the purposes of spooling up a European defense, because obviously they do not have the American backstop against Russia. The same thing will be true of Canada, who's entering into agreements with the EU to be a manufacturer and supplier for that stuff so that they can be part of whatever the new nuclear umbrella is going to be. You have, I believe, similar things going on. It was some loosening of regulations and restrictions in the UK around investment and borrowing. And so, like, you should expect to see those economic engines have some, at least, countervalence against these tariffs of, like, their own investment in themselves and the spurring of consumer markets there that have been a little sluggish for a long time, but since Brexit, for sure, in the UK. They're just acting like it is in fact 1890, and it's not 1890. The world is completely different in every possible dimension.
But equally, like, these massive depreciation of assets now leads to the possibility of buying back your stock, if you're a very large tech company, much more cheaply than you could last year. And since they spend a lot of their money buying back stock, it isn't necessarily a super bad thing for them in the short term, since they'd like to buy back stock a lot and it's cheaper now. I agree.
Yes.
I don't
Keep the rich afloat for sure.
I
Yeah.
don't see it managing like it playing out that way. You're right. But, originally America First was, Lindenberg's racist thing, right? The nature of America First was always isolationist, and to be an
Mhm.
isolationist country comes with, in a global economy, has interesting consequences, one would assume.
Yes.
The transition from a company which basically buys everything from everywhere else to not is going to be challenging, I assume, right? And
Hmm.
it'll take more than a presidential term, if that's what we're talking about still. And yeah, to your point, like America believes itself to be very, very important. It is the biggest power in the world. It does have bases in 120 plus countries. It's hard to overstate that. But to your point, like if you can't rely on it, then it no longer makes you feel safe. If you don't feel safe, which was the whole point of the post-World War II kind of, you know, uh,
Order. Yeah.
global
Yeah.
national or global order, if you whatever it's called, right? So safety is very important to people. It changes how you think about everything, and it very much leads to very serious decisions and behaviors for sure. And yes, right now there's a possibility. The amount of demand America generates is very hard to compensate for if you sell a lot of stuff to America, because it's an unusual place and the amount of things people buy all of the time.
Yes.
There's a reason there's so much advertising in America. It's not just a bit more, it's like 10x per capita any other country. There is a reason.
Yes.
We have a lot of brands all
Yeah.
that all want money. And inevitably there's going to be impacts all the way through all of that over time. And some of the stuff breaks now won't be able to be fixed easily just because they're dismantling systems that have grown organically over 100 years. Some of that won't. I mean, institutional knowledge leaks out of any system, right? Companies are very bad at institutional knowledge. You've been at an agency or a company and somebody very senior or very experienced has been there for a long time, suddenly gets laid off, and suddenly no one knows how to do certain things with certain clients or certain systems because no one else knew.
Yep.
So you take that and you scale it up to the biggest civic infrastructure in history. I imagine there'll be some consequences to that unplugging here and there. The thing is, all of it now is we're reacting in advance of the stuff actually filtering through. This is all the reaction to the beginning, right? And
Yes.
the filtering through will be interesting.
Well, and I think that's also where I'm fascinated by Christopher Mims' comment about things are just going to kind of disappear from the marketplace in the U.S. That, like, there are things that are not one-to-one replaceable with with American producers. So there is not a way to grow bananas in the contiguous United States. Like, a little bit in Hawaii, maybe South Florida. You could do a little grove down there somewhere, but like, no, not really. You're not gonna do that. So you should expect to have. I mean, in some respects, I'm old enough to remember when there were fruits and vegetables that were not available year-round at the grocery store because we did not yet have the systems
It's still
for
very much
supply
the case
chains.
in most places in the world. That's sort of how it works in
Yes.
most places. America is very weird.
Yeah.
It has this.
Totally. And so, like, people are going to find themselves back to a place where you can only get avocados for a couple months a year if you can get them at all. You can only get bananas for a few months a year if you can get them at all. Coffee tariffs are absolutely insane. Unless you love chicory, which grows on the side of the road, so you can make coffee out of chicory. But like, and it's not the worst. It's not the worst kind of coffee, but it is definitely it became popular among like the French military during the First World War because they couldn't get real coffee, and so like it's definitely a replacement, but it is not like the preferred replacement. But there are a lot of
We have energy drinks now. It's fine.
Right. But I think this is some of the stuff where it's like, I mean, and if you went through Brexit in the UK, you saw some of this as well. Like, you're not going to get really nice tomatoes in November. Yeah, like you're not going to get nice tomatoes in November from Spain anymore.
The thing about Brexit is that it never ever stops continuing. It never ends. It can't end. It was a semi-fatal economic decision that has will inevitably lead England, the UK, to less positive economic results for probably a generation or more, and there's very little you can do about it at this point. Do you know what I find really weird recently, right? I keep thinking about this. I'm not a conspiracy theorist. I don't believe people are competent enough to do things that's like this. But anyway, I don't mean people.
Agreed.
I mean people collectively in organizations don't seem to be competent enough to do the kinds of stuff that conspiracy theories want to believe are true. That said, in the last few elections, all over the shop, why is everything 50-50, like exactly 50-50 with like a 0.1 change? Like, but isn't that weird? Isn't mathematically, talking of averages, like, doesn't that seem odd, just statistically speaking? Like, how can we have sorted it out so perfectly into 50-50? I know not everyone votes. I get that. Most people don't vote.
Well,
I get that. It's unfortunate. But still, exactly 50-50 every time. This close.
so I will send you a link to my friend Mike Podorser's. He wrote a piece about kind of flatland versus 3D land in thinking about the
Oh, yeah,
electorate,
okay.
and that it looks a lot more
I know about
three-dimensional
Flatland
when
from
you
the
actually
book.
do think about. Yeah. I mean, he kind of references that, but what he's saying is like when we do the kind of head-to-head thing, it looks 50-50 because there are two choices. And so,
Right, that's true.
we haven't had a landslide in American electoral politics for most of the 20th century was 10 points. So like it's
Huh?
always been within the kind of coin
Right.
toss range anyway,
And
probabilistically.
maybe the electoral college is part of that. It controls the ability for it to not be. I don't know. But yeah.
Well, I mean, you have to that adds a whole other layer to things for sure. Right now, the Democratic center seems to be making an argument that the way to win elections is to be more like Republicans, and that this will win over some Republicans who just don't like Trump very much. And like, this is the David Shor theory of the case. And it's like, that's not really what the numbers actually look like when you look at all the people who didn't vote. Democrats outnumbered Republicans 2-1 on the didn't vote scale in 2024. The group that was even bigger were the independents. Like, independents, 16 million of them, 17 million of them did not vote. 15.5 million Democrats didn't vote. And then about 7.7 million Republicans didn't vote. And so if you want to work a strategy, it doesn't seem to me that the thing you should do is the hardest possible thing, which is get your opponent's supporters to support you.
Change their mind
Instead,
completely. Change their tribe at this point, not even mine.
Right. Exactly. Instead, it seems pretty clear to me that what you would want to do is turn out as much of your base as you possibly can. Encourage the other side to stay home and persuade 55% of the independents to vote for you, or even 30%. Apparently, like Harris needed to win 30% of the independents who didn't turn out to vote in order to win. And so but this is a weird strategy, right?
No, I agree. I think there's a problem with the reasonableness that Democrats believe they have. I mean, American Democrats are obviously right-wing party, right? From a European perspective, the Democrats are right-wing to nearly every party in the Europe. It's just America's just inherently much more right-wing because they care a lot more about money and individuals than collectivism for various historical reasons and so on, right? But like the reasonableness with which they attempt to do things leads them to not communicating well with most people in America who don't read well, right? So that strategy is difficult, and the reasonableness of widening their church in the center, I don't think the center exists in that sort of way anymore because it's not left-right anymore. It's a weird cross thing of stuff that's happened, right? It's not quite as simple as the French Parliament anymore in terms of where people sit. Oh, they're more extreme. So many Americans seem to be only incented to vote on single issues that particularly push their buttons, and that's interesting, but it also means that ends up being what politics is often about in terms of campaigning, which is finding these little things, these single issue beep, beep, beep buttons that you can push really hard. So certain people, usually a small number, but they really care about that thing, be it abortion or gay marriage or whatever it is that, it pisses off whoever. That's a lever you can then trigger anger within. And, the Democrats trying to be more like Republicans isn't necessarily a bad strategy in the sense of messaging. Like the Republicans' messaging sort of fidelity and their ability to just regurgitate the same exact sound bites again and again and again and again in every situation doesn't come as easily, I feel like, to people with more respect for the audience, but who also don't understand people's limited attention and how little they consume news, which is increasingly less. Like people who consume news before ain't consuming it much now. So like it's an even more difficult problem than before because like people vote emotionally. People have no real idea how the government works. People don't know how taxes are paid. They don't really know any of these things. And it's a complex system, and they tend to vote based on their feelings. And I think the feeling is that from one side, they really want to hurt the other side for what they feel like is decades of condescension, essentially. And yes, the consequences will be universal, but when you don't see a pathway to the future at all and you think everyone's making fun of you, you want to burn it down, right? That's sort of the politics of what we've been going through. Unfortunately, there are consequences to this, and they will be not good for anybody, probably in the medium term.
I think this is also a question that I kind of keep coming back to, which is, the people who are spending the money on what I will just refer to here as the demand generation for either of the parties, they get to set the frame of what they want to talk about and how they want to talk about it. They're not actually trying to do a persuasion game, right? What they're trying to do is like trigger an emotional response in you so that you will have essentially a disgust reaction to the other side and therefore vote for their side.
It's motivating apparently to get you to go and vote in a country where it's not legally required and no one gets time off work and jobs are precarious and all that sort of stuff, right? So to your insight, right? Since like the 60s at least, Republicans have realized that the more people vote, the less good it is for them.
Right.
I mean, this has been a very, very specific part of the stated Republican strategy since the 60s. The division, the war on drugs, all these things were designed specifically to break up liberal coalitions to some degree and to disenfranchise through apathy, to make people feel like it's a waste of time to vote in order to disenfranchise enough people that Republicans have a fair chance of winning. Republicans haven't won the popular vote since, a very long time. The system allows them to win if they can keep enough people from voting. That's it. Right?
That's exactly right.
The more people vote, the less likely they are to win. That's just how it works.
Yeah, but what's interesting though is if you run, so this Echelon Insights does this from time to time. They do a simulation where it is not the two-party system. It is more like a 5 or 6 party parliamentary system, and you have essentially like a labor left party. You have what they call in their framework the Acela party, which is socially liberal but fiscally conservative. These are like the wealthy business liberals. What I would rebrand them the nice white parents party.
Okay. Nice.
And then you have a Green Party, and those are your kind of more or less left parties. So think of Labor, Lib Dem, Green ish. And then you have on the other side a kind of traditional pro-business conservative party, and then you have like an evangelical party and a nationalist party. And the interesting thing is, you can very easily get to 60 if you go with Greens, Lib Dem, Labor. But Lib Dems run the Democratic Party. Like the Acela party is in charge of the Democratic Party, and they are far closer to their conservative friends than they are to the Labor left. And the Clinton years basically drove the Labor left out of the Democratic Party at the highest reaches. You have tons of PhDs and nobody who worked on a line. In the Democratic Party.
Yeah, I think your insight is extremely right here. At a certain point, rich people are more like each other than they are like anybody else, regardless of views, politics, because rich people tend to not want to pay taxes a lot in America, especially. And they all tend to work around the same basic things that are important to them. Now, there was an article recently in I want to say New Yorker or Atlantic, something like that, about the comfort class. And this whole problem stems from the fact that people in power have come through the best schools in the country with at least well-off enough parents to allow them to go through schools with a minimal amount of debt. Also to allow them to take jobs in things like politics, journalism, and so on that are basically underpaid, massively so, for the first 20 years, if ever, because they can. Which means that people that take up these positions inherently have lived in a world completely unlike the rest of the country for their entire lives.
Yeah. Well, and I think that's been what's interesting talking to pollsters on theoretically both sides of the aisle. I mean, Echelon is conservative, but not MAGA. And so that's why I'm talking to them. But the thing that's interesting is this kind of underlying all of their theories about what the electorate is really like is this kind of creeping sense, this unease about how people like me, the pollster, don't really understand the middle class, the working class. And I also keep thinking about this as a kind of rebranding exercise a little bit, which is, and I think it was AOC I saw talking about this, which was basically like, if you work for a paycheck, You do not make your money off of investments and carried interest. You know, if you are in the paycheck earning class, you are in the working class, regardless of whether it's in a factory or a Walmart or an ad agency or something else. But if you're living off of investments, if you have a trust fund, you are wealthy. You are something else. You're in the investment class, and then there's the working class. But it's very interesting to talk to these folks and hear their kind of like underpinning all of their theorizing about what the electorate is really like and what they really care about and all of that stuff is just this sense of like, I don't think we really know them. And you know, obviously, as a qualitative researcher, I would say, have you tried talking to them and not just serving them surveys?
No, but like thick data is very different to quantitative data, right? The thick data of sort of holistically undertaken qualitative research provides the kind of insight that only can be done that way because it provides depth, nuance, and, you know, the problem with averages and surveys, like I did a report thing this morning, is that they don't, all the questions are like, they don't quite apply to me anyway. Do you know what I mean? It's like my business isn't like that. Yeah, I don't actually, it's not really how things work in my world. Okay, fine, I'll say D. But you know what I mean? It's like that happens a lot because the survey questions are written from a point of, they're written by certain people, not the people who are taking the survey often. And the whole point of writing good surveys is to make questions that don't create the answers that you actually want, which is what they often can do. It's very easy to do that with phrasing, as you all know. So there's a lot of easy manipulation, and I'm sure polls are standardized at a national level, and there's some kind of data fidelity agreement that companies enter into in research or MRS or whatever. But, you know, lots of pollsters don't play in MRS
there isn't.
Anyway. Do you know what
So
I mean?
one of the things actually that I didn't know until last summer's elections in the UK is that there is a thing called the British Polling Society. And that in political polling, that trade organization essentially regulates the way public pollsters report their findings publicly. So if you're going to do a poll and release it publicly, you have to, within like 3 days of the kind of initial release of the findings, you have to release your methodology, your weights, and basically everything about how you designed the survey. And now, not everybody complies because it's not a government thing, it's a trade organization thing. But there isn't really anything like that here. There are obviously like, you know, organizations representing pollsters and stuff like that in the US, but they don't have that kind of shaming enforcement. If you're going to be a member, you must adhere to these standards kind of thing.
And based on our previous discussion on averages, how you choose to present data and what you think of the confidence level and how people understand what a confidence level is, which is probably 0 people at 0% confidence level. Do you know what I mean? Like that, it's easy to make pictures of numbers that you have that say whatever you want. And we know that. That's just the nature of these things, right? Since 2016, I'm pretty sure I wrote about this that time around, where I believe it was the CEO of McCann called all his McCann people to America, and there was a quote in the paper, which is like, we've misunderstood the nature of aspiration, and we've sort of painted everybody's desire pathways, I'm paraphrasing, as West Coast liberal elite success. And then maybe everybody doesn't want that. And I'm like, everybody would like to have more money. Pretty sure that's true. You know what I mean, Chief? Like at a certain level, if you don't have any money, what you want is money. And if you've got money, you have other decisions you can make. But at a certain level, that's the whole game of America, is how do you make money? That's the game, right? But at the same time, the seeming inevitability that education and income lead towards more progressive values, which is kind of implicit in how society was thinking about itself for a long time. Because essentially, the more education people have, the less likely they tend to be religious, the less likely they tend to be Republican, unless, to your point, they're extremely rich. Sometimes that doesn't work that way, right? But historically, more education, more opportunities, less ideology, less religion, less believing in selfishness. Scarcity changes everybody's values. When there is a sense that there is scarcity in any situation, people do not act collectively very well. They become in-group, out-group immediately. It's a human instinct, right? That's just what happens. Now, how you determine what's in-group and how in-groups are then created by politics and media to try and make you think you're in an in-group is sort of part of the game. Which in-group do you think we're looking after? Because we're not looking after everybody. And that's sort of the nature of making decisions at a national level. But like, so I think that is one where people sort of went, oh, people don't necessarily want to aspire to being progressive. And I was like, no, not everybody does probably, but It's a shame. Actually, like a bunch of things began to change, right? So we've discussed this, I think, before, but the first thing, most obviously, is that research became a thing. Rather than being a thing that was an input to strategy, it became its own thing. So big brands have a research function now separate to their marketing function, which informs insight across the organization. If you're Diageo, Unilever, etc., that means those companies have their own their own agencies, because they want their own agencies which service their needs, and the research companies do research, and planners don't. Planners don't do qual, no one's paying for it, and if you do it, it's a cost that you're taking on as part of a pitch, or because you want to do some work that people So we sort of knew this implicitly. And then there was a big hullabaloo, 2016, UK, US. Let's go out into the country and meet some of the people that we haven't seen for a while, apparently. No one's been doing groups, apparently, ever. And that's a shame, equally, because talking to people, to your point, is sometimes useful, especially if you're a planner and your voice is to be the voice of the consumer. That seems helpful. But it's just like the business model doesn't support it anymore. And that gives a gap in our understanding, no doubt is true, right? And I think we all made genuine efforts towards understanding the things that we weren't understanding. I think young people in the industry were very keen about trying to understand inequalities of class beyond the inequalities of access to advertising, which, to your point, is still an old boys club. I mean, at one point, two of my close friends from Oxford were CEOs of the two biggest ad agencies in London. Statistically speaking, there aren't that many of us. That's unusual, I would say. But it's not, because in our industries, there's loads of us. Journalism, law, there's loads of us, right? We're everywhere, which is representatively unrepresentative by definition. And like, you know, historically, advertising picks from the good universities, the ones that are left that don't apply to banking and law. They still look for those things. Be it Red Brick or Oxbridge in the UK or Ivy League in America, there's still some sense of that. I think different in America, to your point, though, because there's a master's thing and people do ad schools, whereas in the UK that's sort of only for creatives to build a book for a year. Portfolio schools, kind of a different thing. You can argue that American agencies simply gave up the cost of training, because graduate training in the UK is necessary, because graduates don't know anything, because they come out of degrees like geography and English, and you're like, well, you're smart and you can write stuff, you don't know anything, and so we have to teach you stuff, how to do things, right? Whereas American agencies farmed that out to a paid for service that the cost goes on to the customer. And you see this a lot, right?
Yes.
Taking costs and pushing them away from your business onto customers or employees is very common in lots of different markets, and it's going to get worse. The amount of shadow work you now have to do to, say, book a flight probably won't be solved by agentic AI, at least not in the short term, because of the inherent opacity and lack of comparison that is made consciously between different providers to prevent meta-analysis being a fair way to represent the variance. So, you know, I mean, that's going to be interesting. And the other thing, I guess, was that obviously localization is a problem. As somebody wrote about recently, there's not a single postcode in anywhere in London that you can afford to live in on a graduate salary in London, making it very interesting if you decide to move to London, because you already must have money. There's no other choice, right? In America, there's not a single place in any city, as far as I understand it, that you can get a 2-bedroom apartment on minimum wage in the country. There's nowhere it's possible, right? Now, I lived in New York. A lot of agencies are in New York. There are a couple other places where there's like 1 or 2 agencies, but primarily it's New York where the money is, because the media is in New York. The money is there. New York is entirely unlike anywhere else in the world, and it's very unlike anywhere else in America, extraordinarily unlike it. I now live in rural Tennessee, just outside Chattanooga. I can tell you that it's very different here. The shops that are available on the strip mall near where I live are the shops that you know are there. You already know which ones they are. They're all there. That's it. And there are no billboards except for local services and anti-abortion clinics and Jesus, and and guns and stuff. You know,
I was going to add guns.
It's the South, right? So the environment in terms of consumption and media is fundamentally different. And as I wrote about at some point recently, people are spending more time at home on their own than they ever have. Voluntarily, because everyone is done with all this stuff. And that functionally changes the entire consumption ecology of media and products, right? Because the basic trade-off in my head is people are getting a private car for their burritos, to quote the meme about delivery food services, which seems hilarious, except when commuting into work that day would cost you twice as much as the delivery for your burrito, which means that it's a economically sensible choice. Ridiculous as that may seem, because the market has massively depressed the cost of luxuries by crushing employees and massively increased the cost of necessaries like education and housing. So those, again, it creates weirdness in the idea of averages, because the markets are so fundamentally different.
Well, and this, I think, is like it is also baked into some of these recent kind of trend reports, or I don't know, trend reports, reports about demographic tendencies politically in the country. So these kind of stories about young men being more conservative than young women. Still not
Yeah.
as conservative as older men, but you know, it's troubling. But the interesting thing about some of these correlations, right? College education is kind of widely accepted as like there's a diploma divide between Democrats and Republicans and so on. It's like a 60-40 divide. 60% of Democrats have a college degree, 60% of Republicans don't. So
Yeah, so
again, you're
slightly
kind of
over-indexing against national population, but not
right.
massively. So I think it's 40% on average have degrees in America, right?
Exactly. But there is a kind of cultural valence about this that is separate from the question. Because, like, you know, a question I, tried to ask Patrick Ruffini was like, what do you think the mechanism of action is? Like, what is it about going to college that makes you more liberal? And as I have thought about this, because we do a lot of work in higher ed, the greatest predictor of getting a college degree in the United States is your parents have a college degree. The other thing about that is that means that you are already coming up in a family environment and probably in a neighborhood, in a community broadly, that believes that you can go get opportunity someplace else.
Yeah. Yeah, totally.
And if you didn't grow up in that, if you were like, where are the opportunities that don't require me to leave where I am from, then like that's your cultural milieu. So that's one part of it. The other part of it is this social isolation piece, which is like, we got rid of malls. We don't, Starbucks has locked the bathrooms, like whatever. There are all of these kinds of moves to say, and there's also like, oh God, there's a term for it. It's like, I can't remember what it's called, but it's like essentially kind of criminalizing being a kid. So like we don't want groups of 13-year-olds hanging out places.
Hoodies.
It's dangerous. Yeah. And so like, of course they're socially isolated, and the pandemic obviously accelerated that trend to begin with. And then I do think that there is this kind of mismatch. Like the thing from the guy from McCann is not entirely wrong, right? Like you're looking at your social feed going, that's not what it looks like where I live. And that's not what my life looks like. Those kinds of things happen quite a bit. I think that we're sometimes sort of, again, going for the averages, going for the correlations, and not thinking deeply about like the cultural systems that inform these choices and the availability of these choices. And I think like unless we actually do the work of figuring that out, we're just kind of in the wilderness.
No, I agree. I mean, I think so yes, the isolation thing is a whole cultural thing, the shut-in thing in Japan and the no dating thing in Korea. It's not just, it's everywhere. And there's a bunch of probably massively cultural reasons for it, not just the cost of living and the cost of children, which is almost certainly a massive driver in most economies now, in modern economies, right?
Yeah.
On the first front, though, it's like, to the point about opportunity. So first, there's a really good bit of research about the somewheres versus anywheres. I'm sure you came across it during the pando. Somewheres and anywheres, people with graduate degrees in certain languages, skills, basically can work sort of anywhere because they're desirable by some economies. And so like, I don't come from America. I've worked in Australia. Like all that stuff, right? So anywheres, because they can go anywhere and have this sort of sense of opportunity possible, at least they have this skill set or whatever credentialization that enables them to be economically useful in different markets. Anywheres tend to be less educated by that nature because they're not have the transferable global sort of knowledge skills that how long they last is a point of AI consideration to make later, I suppose. But I imagine alienation will come through the knowledge work levels pretty quickly. So anywheres derive their personality, their identity from tradition and location. The pub they go to on Friday, church if you want. Like one of the first things people in the South ask you is, where do you go to church? I'm like, why would I do that? But they do, right? And it's sort of how you localize your community, and it very much focuses on place. So the idea of place becomes super important to you because you've been in this place for generations and blah, 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 regardless of the fact you were immigrants originally, everybody was, right? Somewheres versus anywheres is part of it. The point about opportunity, though, is that I was reading an article by somebody about books, and she said that she was on a board of some charity that was trying to understand literacy. And one of the questions was, what are your happiest memories growing up of going to a bookstore? And she just went, mate, there were no bookstores where I grew up. I went to the library because there were no bookstores in working class wherever. We don't have those things. They are for shishi neighborhoods where rich people live, right? And it's that complete lack of consciousness that situation is not universal is so dangerous. Humans sort of inherently begin to believe that what they do is the normal thing in the world. So people that work in offices tend to believe people all work in offices. They don't. 20% of people work in offices, right? But we think everyone works in offices. So when we write ads, for example, they're often about being in an office or commuting to work because that's what we do. But if you work in a shop, that doesn't apply at all to your life. You know what I mean?
Well, and this is also where there was kind of in the 22, 23 period, there was a lot of this like, are we returning to office? Are we working from home? And there were these arguments about, about how people were accounting for their time. And so, the Bureau of Labor Statistics used to do this kind of time use study among workers. And it was particularly interesting because you had, because they were trying to make the argument that people who say that they work from home only work X number of hours. Yep. And so clearly they're not productive because they're not working 8 hours.
Right. So, yeah. This is this is endemic, right? This is one of the problems we have as a society and in business generally. We don't understand how work works. We still think work is based on factory labor, sequentially creating something that individually people can't make. We think that measuring the amount of time to make the thing is relevant to the product that you make. And in advertising especially, that's just not true. Like there is a lot of time it takes to make things, but most of the time is not taken up doing that. And, you can get to a solution extremely quickly if you're very inspired and not tapping away because a piece of AI is checking your keyboard strokes at your computer. So you're online for 8 hours a day so they get their value out of you. It's like the value isn't the amount of time I put into something, mate. The value is the thing that it comes out of that thing. And if I'm super experienced, which obviously we are, it shouldn't take me as much time as someone else. And frankly, I don't want to therefore charge you for my time. The idea, for example, that timesheets are a great way to value knowledge work or our kind of labor is obviously inherently stupid, but we didn't find another solution yet. Fortunately, AI is appearing, and AI will very much require us all to find a new solution to that kind of business challenge.
Well, I think the other component of this, looking at those time use studies, is that part of what I noticed was that a lot of the people who said that they worked from home also said that they had quite long commutes. And when you started to look at like the underlying employment data, you started to realize, these are part-time workers with multiple jobs. So they have a work from home job, and they are probably exactly the kinds of work from home jobs that are first on the block with AI, because they are probably things like customer service and scheduling and that kind of thing. And then they still in the course of a week have to drive somewhere to their on location job, right? Their retail job or their construction work job. And so like the analysis of that stat that was like, well, but they're only working an average of, 5 or 6 hours a day is like, right, because they're trying to cobble together a living between a work from home job and a work on site job. And none of them are offices. and most of those jobs are probably automatable in some way or another. And so they are precarious to begin with. But to your point, like measuring productivity by number of hours worked is pretty silly when you have automation.
That's important though, but like commuting is bad, right? The costs of commuting get higher and you have to move further away from where you need to work because you haven't got any money. If you commute more than about half hour a day, I believe the research says it becomes the most obvious determinant of negative life experience because it happens every day, twice. And it just gradually makes you feel less and less good about your life. Like I used to commute in London for like an hour and a half. So living at my parents' house, going into London. And then, I couldn't afford to live in London because I was on a graduate advertising salary. But like the cost becomes kind of this prohibitive, both emotionally and in now, like London transport is very expensive. It's both expensive. It's like $6-8 for a travel card for a year or something absurd, right? Which is quite a lot of money if you're making 40. And then it's also the cost of life. It just eats away at your time. Your life isn't being paid to commute, but even if you're on the Google bus, right, they're eating bits of your life for free.
Right.
And it does takes all your energy and your time. It was a bargain predicated on you get paid a lot more to do this stuff if you go into the city or whatever, but I don't know if that makes sense as much anymore. And yeah, I guess we'll see.
So I feel like maybe kind of rounding back to where we started with this kind of the problem of looking at averages instead of the median is is kind of, it feels like if we were looking for kind of a root cause of how we got to here, it might be that, right? It might be thinking about the average all the time and not actually thinking about the
I mean,
context.
yeah, really, when I read this, I thought it was going to be very germane for our talk because I've been thinking about this a lot. We've discussed it before last time we tried. It's like averages disguise a great deal of variance in the minima and maxima if there's a great deal of variance in the minima and maxima. So unless you
Yeah.
assume everything is distributed like this, which it no longer is economically speaking, the average is very misleading. And like, the average salary at an ad agency is probably higher than it would normally understood to be based on the C-suite making so much more than anybody else, right? So the
Yeah.
average salary is probably somewhere, you know what I mean? It's probably pulled up from the median just based on the heavy distribution of very big jobs at the top.
Yeah. I think this is the thing I might also offer is like there was this kind of interim period between when agencies were cost cutting by getting rid of their Yankelevich monitor subscription and
Yeah.
and all of the, Jupiter and Gartner and whatever subscriptions. And just leaving it to Professor Google at all times. I mean, my last agency job was sending my juniors out to just go do Vox Pops in Madison Square Park. Like, you can still go talk to humans without a budget.
Yeah, often we often did that. And then let's be honest, when we were pitching, we would often pretend people at the agency were Vox popping so they'd say what we wanted them to say, right? That's kind of how
That's
pitch theatre
true.
always works. I mean, of course it is, right? I mean, the whole point of Vox Pops is you can get anything out of it if you want it. Like, it's just sort of, but yeah, qualitative insight is tricky. And I think, yeah, it's structural. We've had this challenge for a while. Agencies need to try and think more broadly and diversely about markets, right? If, according to Michael Farmer, P&G has grown at like 1% for the last 10 years. So it's growing less fast than inflation. So is Heinz. Whereas other companies grow faster, but like that's weird because they spend a lot of money on advertising and stuff, right? And the nature of those businesses by their scale is that they have to appeal to a very, very large group of people who don't hate each other ideally. That's just
Right.
going to be harder and harder as, countries begin to buy their own products because of the stuffs and various things get caught up as avatars, emblems, or whatever in a culture war battle that increasingly is sort of just, it's like the oil slick theory of politics. It just it'll attach to anything now. The sides will attach to anything, and if one side attaches to it, the other side begins to hate it, regardless of what it is. Is it lattes before and avocados?
Yeah.
Now it's like flour, whatever it is. It always, anything will get filtered into these two sides, which I think is a challenge. If you're a mass market middle brand, right, that sells stuff to a vast swathe of what used to be the middle class, that's going to be a structural challenge. There's less of whatever the middle class is. There's a tiny number of rich people. And then there's a whole segment of people who think at least they're boycotting or buying an identitarian, but they probably aren't, but they probably pretend to. Bud Light had been the biggest selling non-signifying beer brand of watery yellow stuff for decades. You don't keep, at a certain point, something changes because people get mad bored. I mean, that's just the nature of these things, right? That's why companies buy other startups in their category and then start doing that instead.
Yeah. I mean, that's an interesting ideal on its own of just like basically creating regional brands, creating national brands that are all owned by Heinz or Kraft or whomever.
Very regional. Yeah, I mean, Canada Tire was on SNL. I don't know. Apparently that shop doesn't sell tires, but hey, you do what you want, Canadian. Have fun.
Exactly.
But like, yeah, I mean, and America is interesting. It has loads of regional brands. America is not one country to our previous conversations. In the UK, national media exists and national brands exist, and there's 4 banks. In America, there's like 600 banks. Supermarkets may be bigger than a Tesco's, but only in 5 states. The scale of America is very hard to get your head round if you're from a European country because it's so... Every state is like its own European country. Give it that sense, right? That's sort of how it works.
Yeah.
California is bigger than most of European countries by itself.
Right. It's like the 4th largest economy in the world or something. I think this is also important for our cousins over on the political side of marketing, which is like trying to talk about the average American, everyday Americans. And it's like, who are you talking about?
Like where I live, there are mom and pop stores. I've been here a year. Most of them are going away. Lots of big apartment buildings, and Chase appeared recently because people have started moving here, and therefore the big brands appear because they're like, money is here now, cool. Mom and pop stores, people die off, and they're not being replaced. Somebody opened a sandwich shop, then got sick, it collapsed 6 weeks later. I was like, it's a shame, it was near where I lived.
Yeah.
But the idea that there's a sort of average family with an average hardworking man and a trad wife. Even just saying that triggers most people in America now, right? Just the idea, but just that image of what is average annoys the vast majority of both sides of the family for various reasons. So it's like, yes, it's really hard to say, I'm fighting for average Americans. Well, what does that mean? There's huge variance now in what that. So I think that's a good place to end it. Average no longer means average. It means something else.
It means something very. It's a fiction. It does not exist. Yeah.
It's a smoothing out of data, which is done for mathematical reasons and based on an assumptive distribution curve, which no longer applies. So
and I'll say one last thing. The people who fell in love with averages did so because they liked the beauty of the standard distribution. Like they literally found it aesthetically pleasing. And so this became the obsession. How do we get things into that average so that we can maintain our standard distribution? Because that is beautiful.
You cut off the outliers. You just keep cutting off the outliers till you get what you want.
Well, that's what I do.
I mean, there is decisions to be made in any set of data. Scientists do the same thing.
Absolutely.
Like at a certain point, it depends on what you're doing it for. Are you fitting? Are you overfitting? Are you trying to make it do what you want it to do? Yeah, that's cheating. Is it germane that one person is all the way off the charts? No, not really. Most people aren't giants. So that isn't that helpful in understanding height, but a small number of people are rich, like they'd be 100 feet tall on the standard distribution curve. They'd be like, wait a second, it all seems fine up to here. And at the very end, everyone becomes massively tall. Like there are different species. You know what I mean? It's like Great Danes and Chihuahuas distribution of heights rather than humans. That's what the economy looks like now. Great Danes and Chihuahuas. There we go.
Maybe we have a show title, Great Danes and Chihuahuas. Well, Faris, I have to do the standard podcast outro. How can people follow your work?
Oh, great. Well, I don't really look at Twitter much anymore if I can avoid it because it's sad. I guess the best way probably is our newsletter, which comes out every week by us and every other week. Every other week by us and every other week by a guest contributor. Today's guest contributor is one of my favorite writers, John Higgs, who's got a new book about Doctor Who coming out. It really is very exciting for me. I'm a huge fanboy of his work, and he's like, yeah, I'll do a newsletter. I'm like, wicked.
That's very
cool.
So
Strands of Genius, which can be found at, geniussteals.co, or just Google Strands of Genius, or Google my name, Faris. And yeah, all the stuff I write and this and that sort of stuff will all be available there alongside things that aren't purely self-aggrandizing, because I believe in content as something people want to read, not just talking about myself.
Excellent. It is a good newsletter. I have written for it once, and it's lovely.
Appreciate you. Right.